Everyone, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining our webinar today. The topic is Beyond Habitat 3, What Comes Next? My name is Christopher Swope. I'm the managing editor of Citiscope. If you don't know us, we're an independent online news site covering urban innovations in cities around the world. And we've been intensively covering the lead up and aftermath of the UN's Habitat 3 Conference on Cities. This conference was held in Quito, Ecuador, and wrapped up just about 1 month ago. At Citiscope, we think the story didn't end in Quito. It's really just beginning as governments turn to implementation. And for city leaders, that story is deeply linked with other important agendas, like the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement. So we intend to stay on this beat, following local solutions to these global goals. And that's what our conversation today is about. In Quito, nations around the world agreed to a 20-year strategy for sustainable urbanization. It's called the New Urban Agenda. So what comes next? What do we expect national governments to do? What can city leaders and civil society do on their own? Where does the urban movement go from here? These are some of the questions we'll be asking today. And before I introduce our panel, I'd like to say how you can ask questions. The way it works on this platform is, unless you're a panelist, we can't see you, we can't hear you, but you can ask questions. You want to look on the bottom of your screen at the different icons at the bottom of the Zoom panel and look for Q&A. And if you click on that, it will pull up a box, and that's where you can ask questions. I'll be monitoring those questions throughout our hour of conversation, and I'll do my best to work them into the conversation. And one more thing is, as we go along, I'm going to be asking you some questions just to get a sense of where our audience is coming from on these issues. Let me see if I can pull the first one up here. I wanted to ask everyone that's joined us today, did you attend Habitat 3? And go ahead and answer that question, and we'll come back to the results in just a minute. Now I'd like to introduce our guests. First, joining us from the University of Pennsylvania here in the United States is Eugenie Birch. Eugenie is the Nussdorf Professor of Urban Research, and she also leads the General Assembly of Partners, which is a sort of umbrella group of stakeholders that works throughout the Habitat 3 process and is continuing on after as well. Next, we have Nicholas Yu, who is joining us from Kenya. Nicholas is the Director of Global Partners and Programs at the Guangzhou Institute for Urban Innovation. At Habitat 3, he ran the Business Roundtable and Business Assembly, and Nicholas also has the distinction of being one of the select few to have attended all 3 Habitat conferences dating back to 1976. And third, joining us from Durban, South Africa, we have Christine Platt. Christine is a past president of the Commonwealth Association of Planners. She also was part of South Africa's delegation at Habitat 3 and chairs the Ministerial Advisory Panel for the Minister of Human Settlements in South Africa. I'm gonna just do a quick check on the poll here. Did you attend Habitat 3? Looks like we are almost evenly split, yes and no. So that's good to know. So for some of you, Quito is still fresh in your mind, and for others, perhaps you wish you could have been there. And that's a good segue into how I wanted to lead off this conversation. Before we jump into the questions of what comes next after Habitat 3, I would like our guests to take a minute and reflect back on what actually happened in Quito. It was a massive, massive event, 30,000 people. And it was not just diplomacy and policy. There were hundreds of side events, roundtables, urban talks, giant exposition area. My personal favorite was something called the Habitat 3 Village, where actual working urban innovations were on display in parks and city streets. And there were even multiple alternative events at universities and elsewhere. So I'd like to kick off the conversation by asking each of our guests today, of all the things that happened at Habitat 3, what stood out to you and why? And I'd like to start with Eugenie Birch. And Eugenie, let's make sure that you're not muted. Eugenie, are you
Thank
there?
you, Chris.
Yes.
Good morning, everybody. Most to me were several things. I'm sorry, it's not just one thing. First of all, that the endorsement of the member states of the New Urban Agenda and its later lack of reservation activity here in New York is the single most important thing that's happened. This has very important ideas and prescriptions for what we need to do going forward to create good housing and sustainable urban development. The second thing I would like to bring your attention to is the fact that the 16 stakeholder groups of the General Assembly of Partners created 6 roundtables and 4 assemblies, of which Nicholas was organizing 1. And these were very successful conversations and thinking about the role of these groups in the coming period. The last thing I'd like to bring your attention to was the creation of a very beautiful piece of public art. That was done by the Persons with Disabilities, who gathered many people with umbrellas to spell out the word inclusion, and then a drone flew over this site and did a beautiful piece of work, which I will forward to Chris for your forwarding to see this work, to remind us that the New Urban Agenda is for everybody, everywhere.
Great, thank you, Jeannie. Nicholas, how about you? What stands out to you in thinking back now a month after Habitat 3?
Well, also because, as Jeannie said, I ran the business, and you said I ran the business roundtable and the business assembly. I think the one area that was really new for this series of conferences was the fact that business was present. It wasn't as present as it was at Rio +20, but they were there and they were engaging and they were coming with their initiatives and with their commitments on how to go forward. Now, I say this is significant because I actually participated in managing Habitat 2, and when I knocked on the door of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development in 1994 and asked them if they would like to take a seat at the table for Habitat 2, they actually said they were not interested in cities. So 20 years later, we can see the massive shift. Not only is business engaged, but business is engaged very deep in issues of urban sustainability, in issues of cities and climate change, and the whole issue of how we can foster more prosperity.
Great, thank you, Nicholas. Christine, how about you? What was your memory from Habitat 3?
Hi, Chris. I think there are 2 things that I would like to highlight coming out of Quito. And the first is that Quito was a milestone on a very long journey that we are all taking. And for me, one of the most critical starting points to give the context to Quito was the World Urban Forum in Vancouver, where we started a serious discussion about the need to reform our thinking and change our thinking in order to be able to manage cities in the 21st century because of urbanization, poverty, impacts of climate change. And the arguments that put forward then were that we needed new thinking around governance and planning as a form of governance that is integrated, works across silos, that is participatory, it includes everybody, and that is strategic and doesn't become bedded down in very focused micromanagement of any particular issue. And for me, I think if you turn your thoughts back to the World Urban Forum in 2006, I don't think we would have ever dreamt that 10 years later, we would be in Quito with all the member nations of the United Nations adopting the new urban agenda. And I think the events over the last 10 years, underpinned by things like the work around the SDGs, have delivered the most amazing outcome, which I really do not believe we dreamt was possible in the space of just 1 decade. And some people have said, oh, but there's nothing new about the new urban agenda. Well, it was drafted by the biggest range of experts on all sorts of topics from around the world. So it does reflect, I think, some of the most up-to-date thinking. And for me, what really was new is what I've just mentioned, and that is the fact that we have the member states of the United Nations stepping up to say, yeah, we actually now commit to delivering on this new urban agenda in the next 20 years. And I think it's that action or that commitment, which for me is remarkable and which is really very new. And then the other thing I thought I'd just reflect on for Quito, just a little bit more specifically around Quito. It was an amazing gathering, as you've said, with people from all walks of life and from all corners of the globe. And it was really very big. But I think I carried a little bit of a disappointment or a regret away from Quito, in that I think that it remained rather like the Habitat 3 logo. The three little columns kind of remained in parallel, and I don't think there was as rich a mixing of the government delegations, civil society, as perhaps there could have been in other places. And many of us were in wonderful discussions, rooms around the Agora, which is where the main government delegations were, and there didn't seem to be much interaction. And I don't know what's happened to the outcomes of those rich discussions which civil society had. And I think there was something of a regret or a missed opportunity around the level of engagement between all the players who were present in Quito.
Interesting. Thank you, Christine. You know, you mentioned the New Urban Agenda and the contents of it. I did want to launch a poll here just to get a sense from those of us who are on the webinar, how familiar you are with the New Urban Agenda. Are you very familiar with it? Perhaps quoting paragraphs from it in everyday talks, somewhat familiar, or not familiar at all? In other words, what is this thing you're talking about, the New Urban Agenda? And as you were voting on that, I wanted to ask a second question and maybe start turning the page out of Quito and onto the what comes next. And that question is, how will we know if Habitat 3 was a success? And when will we know it? How long will it take to really make that assessment? Christine, do you want to start with that one?
Yes, Chris, I think for me, the period to the next habitat is 20 years. And I think, obviously, in 20 years' time, we will be able to look back and with hindsight and say, yes, this was good, or yes, we've achieved that. But for those of us who are working right now in the middle of delivering on this, I think I'd like to quote what Nicholas said yesterday in a conversation about we have a period of 3 to 5 years where we have to be able to demonstrate how much national government is taking on board the 165 paragraphs of the New Urban Agenda with the host of different commitments that they've made, and the extent to which they are putting in place implementation strategies around those commitments. So, Nicholas, sorry to pinch your answer, but I think we have probably a period of 3 to 5 years for some telling answers to the question of how well we're going to do. And if we don't succeed over the next 20 years, we would have missed a wonderful opportunity to lay a critical foundation for the urbanization that we know is happening this century.
Well, Nicholas, she set you up there. So 3 to 5 years. Why do you think 3 to 5 years is a critical period?
Well, first of all, we have to look at the urbanization trends, right? And we're expecting a doubling of the urban population in the next 35 to 40 years. So in 20 years, we can assume that the urban population is going to grow very, very rapidly, because also in the projections, we foresee after 20 years, a slight tapering off of the pace of urbanization. So actually the next 20 years are going to experience very, very rapid urban growth, urban development, and urbanization. And I think if we don't have a roadmap, a clear roadmap of where we want to go within the next 3 to 5 years, we'll still be bickering about what needs to be done. So that's why I stress the sense of urgency that, that means that within the next 3 to 5 years, we should have completed rapid assessments of where we are. We should have done analysis of where our weak points are, be they in terms of policy, be they in terms of strategy, be they in terms of capacity building, and also the latter. Many countries which are experiencing the most rapid urban growth are doing so not in just the big cities, but in secondary and tertiary. These cities seldom have the capacity to deal with rapid change. And so it will be critical that we put in place the kinds of capacity building strategies that will allow those cities to not only cope with the growth, but to be able to guide that growth in a much more sustainable manner.
Jeannie, how about you? How will we know if Habitat 3 was a success?
Well, first of all, I would like to assert that we do have a roadmap. We do have a roadmap in the global agreements that have made through the SDG. For means of implementation that deal with capacity, knowledge, and financing. So we have a roadmap that's there at the global level. It'll be up to the nations to take that roadmap and take it and move with it. We also have a structure for testing at the global level where we're going with this. Already planning is beginning for WOOF 9 in 2018, and that will lead into the HLPF, which is the high-level political forum that deals with the SDGs, and in 2018 they'll be looking at the Goal 11, which is the one on cities, among others. Then in 2020, that will have what is mandated in the New Urban Agenda, the 4-year quadrennial review. Again, the nation state has to say what they're doing. 2022, another WOOF, and 2026, there we are 10 years after Habitat 3. So we have a global structure. It's now essential that we translate the global structure into national and local activities. And that's where it's going to be very important for all of us who are concerned with this to start putting the pressure on our national governments. The Habitat 3 was only a beginning of a long-term process, as everybody's talked about, but it's a long-term process that has intermediary steps in which there will be checks to see what's happening. And nothing will happen unless we are active in pushing for, asking for the elements of the global agreements that we have before us. We know what to do. The question is, we must find the political will to do it.
Jeannie, you mentioned the woof. For anybody who doesn't know what the woof is or think that's a sound that a dog makes, tell us what the woof is and why the next one's important.
The WOOF, I'm sorry for using an acronym. I tell my students never to do that. At any rate, it is a forum. And I think Nicholas was the father of the World Urban Forum. He can give you some background on that, but you should know that the 9th one will occur in Kuala Lumpur in around February of 2018. So planning is starting now. It will be organized by the Habitat 3 Secretariat, and call for papers will likely go out in the early winter. Call for participants. This World Urban Forum will become an important device, structural device, to use globally to happening and report and monitor, to give ideas about best practices. Lots of things can happen there. We have to make sure they do.
Great, thank you. So let's just take a quick look at the poll here. So most of our people today are pretty familiar with the New Urban Agenda, about half very familiar, about half somewhat familiar. It's good to hear. I'm going to ask one more because I want to shift into a little bit more in the way of questions about what we should expect from nations. So I wanted to ask you all this question. How ready is your country to implement the New Urban Agenda? And as you're answering that, I want to ask our guests today, what should we expect nations to do? Should we expect them to do something? What should we expect them to do? When should we expect that of them? Jeannie, you want to? I know you referenced some of this, but you want to just sort of pick up what should we expect nations to do in this next couple of years?
Well, some nations are more advanced than others in terms of being prepared to do something. Some nations had national delegations that included civil society, such as the United States delegation, of which I was a member. The nations need to gear up what they are going to feel are the most important initiatives locally or nationally, locally for them, and then reach down into looking at what their metropolitan regions and cities are doing as well, because at the heart of the New Urban Agenda will be the strength of activities that will happen at the local level. And I'm sure everyone else will want to say something about that. Yet at the same time, national governments need to examine what enabling environment that they need to provide in order to allow the different levels of government to undertake the activities that they are best able to do. One of the principles of the New Urban Agenda is subsidiarity. That is, having levels of government undertake the kinds of activities that are most appropriate for them. For example, national governments need to think about how to allow localities to undertake their functions. Might have to do with property rules, it might have to do with financing and so forth, and also going down to the local government has to also have the enabling environment that it creates to undertake the activities that are specified. For example, having an appropriately strong and talented planning function would be important at the local level. I'll let others continue this conversation.
Nicholas, I want to go to you next, but before we do, I just want to note that looks like the results so far of the question, how ready is your country to implement the New Urban Agenda? 11% say very ready. I want to ask those people who did say that, if you could find, there's a chat feature here that seems to be where the conversation on the sidelines is going on, which is good. You can go ahead and ask questions there. If you can find the chat feature, if you're from one of these countries that is ready, very ready to implement, could you just say what country that is? I'd be curious to know, because we are looking for stories to tell. But Nicholas, you want to go ahead and answer that question? What should we expect nations to do in the next 3 to 5 years, as you put the timeline?
Yeah, I think there are several things they need to do. First one is that there are only a minority number of countries that actually have an urbanization policy or an urban policy. So I think there's a big catch-up there. Governments will have to really look very seriously at the opportunity to take advantage of the New Urban Agenda and to adopt a national urbanization policy. That doesn't mean that they will be dictating what cities need to do or whatever, but they need to take stock of this urbanization. They need to link it with other major development issues. I mean, this is no longer a question of, one of the outcomes of Habitat 3 is that this is not just a conference about housing and urban development. It's about housing, urban development, and the role of housing and urban development in economic development, in prosperity, in social inclusion, in all environmental sustainability, all of these issues. So I think especially those countries that are urbanizing quickly, they will need to really, I would really like to see them adopt an urbanization policy and strategy. So that's one thing. The other thing I think that is critical, even more, even though it was said already at Habitat 2, but I think it's even more important, is that no single actor can implement the New Urban Agenda alone. It's neither government nor private sector nor civil society alone can do this. So I think it's incumbent upon government to open up that space for real dialogue. Like the kind of dialogue we experienced during the preparatory process. I agree with Christine, we didn't have that much dialogue in Quito itself, but to really open up a dialogue space where members of civil society, policymakers at all levels, leaders at all levels, from community to national leaders can actually, and the private sector, can engage in real dialogue on the way forward. Because it's going to take all of these stakeholders moving together in order to implement the New Urban Agenda.
Great, thank you, Nicholas. Christine, same question to you. What do nations need to do? And maybe you can also tell us what South Africa is doing.
Okay, well, first of all, if you look at the New Urban Agenda, in the opening sections, it exhorts us to start thinking differently, and it starts talking about paradigm shifts. So clearly, it's looking to us to start working differently and to doing things differently. What can government do? Well, I think it's very important to remember that although at Quito there was perhaps a Minister of State representing government from a particular area of endeavor, the agenda itself, and if you look at it, it's very, very cross-cutting. It deals with many, many different issues, and it deals with issues that are new in the urban agenda for those of us who've worked in the urban field before. And it's starting to look very carefully at things like financial mechanisms, health, and areas of expertise that perhaps we traditionally have not thought of as being human settlements types of professions or activities. So the first thing that government has to do, and that's a conversation which we're certainly having here in South Africa, is what do we now do in order to start implementing the new urban agenda across the different silos of government and across the spheres of government, whether it's national government, local government, or some kind of regional or provincial government. So those conversations have started, bearing in mind the kind of time frames which we've already spoken about in this conversation. And then, Chris, perhaps something which I could touch on now is, in order to make sense for me, to make sense of the 165 paragraphs of the new urban agenda, I did a distillation which I have shared with you, and you can flash it up on the screen if you want to, or maybe Citiscope can make it available, should it want to make it available. But in order to make sense of the multitude of commitments in the new urban agenda, I have distilled it into a few headings to help with our implementation, and it's around national policy, the issues around governance, the issues around integrated planning, the issues around finance, the issues around housing, and the issues around knowledge and capacity. So if you look at those, and I won't dwell on them in detail, you can interrogate them for yourselves later, but it's very clear that there's a very clear set of issues which government has to now start grappling with. And then when you delve into those paragraphs themselves, there are even more pointers and clues. And I'll give you just one example, and that's in clause 90 of the new urban agenda. It talks of the international guidelines on urban and territorial planning, which have been done by UN Habitat in order to give national government, local government, civil society, and the planning profession a set of principles to work on around delivering the new kind of planning which I spoke about in my opening statement in this webinar. So I think the agenda is clear. I think it makes huge sense. I think that there is some very nice new thinking that's coming out of this agenda. And if we can deliver this agenda in the next 20 years, and if government can find the way of working in the partnerships which are going to be absolutely crucial for delivering on this agenda, then I think we should get there. And I think if you interrogate the documentation, then the roadmap and the methods and what has to be done actually becomes quite clear and not really that complicated.
And Christine, I want to go to the first question from our audience, which I think relates to some of these partnerships. Amelia Saez from the United Cities and Local Governments asks, what role do you see for local government in this? Can you address that, perhaps from the South African context?
Yes, absolutely. I'm a little bit biased, perhaps, because of my South African background, because after 1994, we were able to turn the page and start again with almost everything. And one of the things we started again with was governance. And if I could just digress slightly, at the German Habitat Forum in June, there was significant discussion around the need for new forms of governance. And interestingly, in the civil society discussions in Quito, I ran quite often into this issue of the need for governance reform in order to deliver on the complexity of the urban agenda in the 21st century. And if you turn to the new urban agenda, Chris, you'll see mentioned in a lot of places, for example, the issue of partnerships under the area of governance is mentioned in clauses 40, 43 and 46. The issue of the coordination role of local government is mentioned. The need to strengthen urban governance is mentioned 3 times in paragraphs 13, 87, and 88. And I could go on, but the section of the new urban agenda dealing with governance is very clear around the need for partnerships, around the need to include local government. Jeannie's mentioned the issue of subsidiarity. And I believe that this reflects an understanding that the member states who have signed up to this commitment in Quito have acknowledged through what they have committed to, that in fact it is absolutely imperative that the partnerships are developed and strengthened, particularly with local government, but also with civil society, and then with the professions as well.
Nicholas, how about you in terms of the role for local government? I know with your role with the Guangzhou Institute, you see all kinds of innovative policies and programs that local governments around the world are implementing. What role do you see for local government and the implementation side and maybe at this point we should broaden the discussion from the New Urban Agenda to kind of this broader basket of issues that the New Urban Agenda interlays with the Sustainable Development Goals, Paris Climate Agreement, and indeed other global frameworks. What's the role for local government, Nicholas?
Yeah, I would tend to say that local government in general is the key actor. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Even if we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, clearly more than 50 or 60% of them will have to be implemented at the local level for them to be effective. There's no way that we can really deal with health and well-being issues, poverty alleviation issues, etc., without it having concrete action on the ground at the local level. So definitely local authorities will be at the forefront of implementing the New Urban Agenda and the other dimension of the SDG. The question is that local governments are not always in a position to be able to scale up what they're doing. And that's why it comes back to the critical question of what central government has to do. Because it's central government that through enabling policies and legislation can ensure that what Jeannie referred to as the best practices, or as I referred to as the urban innovations that we see every day coming out of the woodwork, can effectively go to scale. Because that's the question. There's no question in my mind that cities are, ready to implement, they're ready to engage in the type of partnerships in order to go forward. The question is, how do we bring that to scale? How do we make sure that lessons are learned quickly enough so that not just 2, 3, 4, 5 metropolitan areas and territories take the leadership in going forward, but that all cities can move forward together.
Great, thank you. And Jeannie, how about you? What role does local government have here?
Well, I've already said very strongly that, and I agree, of course, with what Christine and Nicholas have said, local government will be at the forefront, but the local government simply cannot do it alone. Local government will need the enabling environment that will allow local government to do things. And that ranges from appropriate powers given to local government, which is a structural activity that has to be related to the national urban policies and moving down, but also the capacity building. Just think of where the growth is going to be in these smaller, mid to small cities, and think about the huge amount of capacity that is needed, the huge amount of knowledge that is needed, the exchange of information bring forth the kinds of changes that we are talking about. And so this means that there's a huge role for all the are involved in thinking about sustainable urbanization. And this ranges from, obviously, I'll say the academics and scholars, to the grassroots who have local knowledge, to the professionals that have exercised certain expertise, to the business sector that has a different kind of expertise. I mean, I could go through the whole roster of characters who are going to play and must play a role in this. And the question is how to organize and make that collaboration functional and strong And this will take a lot of effort and organization and talk together, not to be pursuing singular interests, but to think about the collective interest in creating and moving sustainable urbanization, what the tools are to get there. And so this is why the kinds of conversations we're having today here on Citiscope, the work that Citiscope has done to explain what sustainable urbanization is and the processes are essential. The fact that there are convenings every couple of years, the World Urban Forum and other activities, the fact that you have things like the peace fair that Nick was just attended, and his group that he was helping won the Global South Prize for a technology application that will help improve lives in informal settlements. I mean, there's a whole raft of things that can and need to be done. It's just a question of how we organize ourselves and work to enhance the huge amount, enhance and coordinate and bring together and synthesize the huge amount of talent, skills, ideas that exist around the world. We can do it. There's no question. The knowledge is there. It's a question of how we energize, focus, synthesize, and collaborate.
Great, thank you. And I apologize. I think I was supposed to click a button here to share the results of these polls. So if you didn't see this before, the question we had before, how ready is your country to implement the new urban agenda? There's the results. So and the folks who said that their country is very ready, the two I heard from were Germany and Austria. So we'll have to go do some stories in Germany and Austria and find out why they're more ready than others. I want to shift to a question that has come in from Maria de Silveira Lobo, and this is getting to the question of the intersection between the new urban agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, which there's a very, very strong connection between those. She asks, I would like to learn about how the new urban agenda advanced the topic of urban health. Would you say it advanced regarding the Sustainable Development Goal 11 and its 10 targets? So I think that's, did the new urban agenda advance the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly around urban health? Anyone want to grab that one?
Yeah, I can respond to that. Thank you for your question. The new urban agenda speaks directly to the issue of health. And from what I can find, the issues of health and safety are specifically mentioned in 3 different places in the new urban agenda. So yeah, remembering that the urbanization process deals with a massive array of everything, from enabling policy and legal frameworks of national government all the way down to waste management at local government level. It's a plethora, and that's why it's so long. But yes, the health issue and health and safety are specifically mentioned in the new urban agenda.
Jeannie, you wanted to jump in on that one as well.
Sure. I think we have to think very broadly about the definition of health. And if you look at Goal 11, you will see that the main targets have to do with housing. You've got to have good housing to have good health. Transportation. We need to make sure that people have different multimodal types of transportation so they can walk and they can also get to where they're going safely. And this has been mentioned, waste and air pollution, resilience, make sure that cities are located in cities. I mean, the point is that health is dealt with very indirectly but directly in the 7 targets. But also, if you go to the, as was mentioned earlier, it's actually more than 60% of the targets that are in the SDGs have to be implemented at the local level. And if you look at the health issues, if you're talking about communicable and non-communicable diseases, which is basically what health is about, you would see that having a healthy environment will be essential to achieving these kinds of ends. And clearly, the health services that need to be delivered that are part of the SDG on health is intimately related to the smooth functioning of the environment that is the cities and regions where people live.
Yeah, I would like to agree with the 2 previous speakers. Health is very much there, and it's very much a definition of health more along the lines of health and well-being. So that basically what the new urban agenda does is gives a further boost to the Sustainable Development Goals in saying that what we need is a systems approach in order to really improve health and well-being. That it's just not just a matter of medical services, it's a matter of lifestyle choices that come down to how we plan our cities.
Great. We've got another question from this came in by email from Juan Velasco Urquiaga at Techo in Peru. Juan writes, I'm currently part of an NGO whose main focus is to work in human settlements in Peru. We want to overcome poverty, working together with neighbors and volunteers to improve the habitat in slums. How does the new urban agenda help us accomplish this? Is the document a really powerful tool to gain political leverage on this issue of slums and poverty? Anyone want to grab that one?
Maybe if I could digress slightly, Christopher, there was a fascinating program on, I think it was BBC, if I'm allowed to cite a competitor, and it was a Swedish demographer talking. I can't remember his name at the moment, and he was he presented the most astounding television program, and in it he suggested that in fact we're dealing exceptionally well at the moment with poverty, and extreme poverty is something which is being dealt with very, very positively and very successfully around the world. And I think that, again, if you look at the roadmap that's been put in place, and if you look at the contents of the documents that we're talking about, like the New Urban Agenda, the international guidelines on urban and territorial planning, if you look at the SDGs, they talk constantly around local economic development, and talk constantly around social inclusion, and they talk about slums and informality and how to manage and deal with those things. So I think that if you turn the clock back to 2006, when I spoke about the World Urban Forum in Vancouver, one of the three critical challenges identified at that stage was the increasing incidence of poverty and urban poverty. And I think that there's been a remarkable focus on those issues in the intervening period. And if this commentator on the televisions be believed, then it appears that these actions are starting to pay dividends across the world.
Jeannie, the question was, is the New Urban Agenda a really powerful tool to gain political leverage on this very issue? Any thoughts on that?
Sure. I keep emphasizing the importance of collective action, cooperative, collaborative, collective action. And it is strengthening those networks that exist or can exist in all sectors of society, having the conversations about what's important, and then moving towards the political ends of achieving those important things is really going to be critical to addressing the issue that our questioner brought up, that if we have in cities, as we do in many places, 40, 50% of the population living in informal settlements, this is a very significant portion of a population that needs to be worked into the political arena. And so it is incumbent upon every sector of civil society, as well as local government, regional government, national government, to recognize the strength and power and the actual existence of 40 or 50% of a population living in informal settlements. So I emphasize again, collective action, conversation, and working together towards the ends that we believe will achieve sustainable urban development.
Nicholas, how about you? What do you think on this question?
Yeah, sorry, I was temporarily muted. Power cuts every few minutes here in Mombasa.
Well, we haven't lost you yet, so we're pleased about that.
The there are 4 words in the urban agenda which I think are very significant, and they are the right to the city. And even though the urban agenda didn't go as far as most civil society actors wanted to see it go in terms of the right to the city, it does introduce a very important lever for those who are working and living in the informal economy to engage with their respective local and national governments on this issue. Because basically, if we are still living in slums without access to basic services such as water, sanitation, energy, etc., it's basically because these people still don't have the right to the city. And I think this is a very important entry point for slum dwellers and those who are trying to help slum dwellers to engage with the authorities, whoever they may be, national or local or state governments, in order to start the conversation that Jeannie alluded to.
Nicholas, can I ask you a specific question about the business community? That was your involvement with the business roundtable and the business assembly. And I actually saw you last week at the Smart Cities conference in Barcelona, which is very much a giant business conference related to cities. And we talked there about what an amazing presence of business here to, you know, intersect with cities as a market. Habitat 3, you mentioned the greater presence of business than at Habitat 2, but it still was a fairly modest presence in the overall picture. So I guess my question to you is why is there this sort of disconnect between what you see at, say, Habitat 3 in terms of the business involvement and what you see at, you know, a Smart Cities conference? And what should we expect from business when it comes to implementation of the new urban agenda?
In my mind, we cannot implement the new urban agenda without seeking active partnerships with the private sector. I mean, if we look at the original definition of sustainable development, the 3 pillars, social, economic, and environmental, today we have to expand that to include 3 other things. One is governance. Second thing that we have to add is the financial dimension that several people have already brought up in the chat space. And the third one is technology. Technology is going to shape, whether we like it or not, the cities of the future. And this is what you saw in Barcelona, was a massive presence of thousands of companies that are positioning themselves to help shape the city of the future, whether it be in energy, whether it be in day-to-day city administration, be it in transport, mobility, etc. So, and we're seeing that already. We're seeing how certain breakthrough technologies are beginning to change the way cities function. So I think that business is definitely, the business sector, the industry sector is definitely on board. They are going to go ahead. They're going to go ahead and work with cities. The question is, we have a critical role to play in the international arena, and that includes, for example, the World Urban Forum, etc., to create the necessary dialogue so that we can build the trust that is required for effective partnerships to take place. I think I wouldn't be saying something outrageous by saying that there's still a lot of mistrust of the private sector out there. There's still many countries that I work in, cities that I work with, that have a fundamental mistrust of the business sector. We have to build that trust up, because it's the business sector that has the solutions of tomorrow. They have the technology, and often they have the business models that will allow cities, and I think cities all over the world are struggling with this similar issue, is how to do more with less. And so they're a critical partner, and I would say that one of the key things that everybody needs to do is to make sure that we enter into a meaningful dialogue between local authorities, civil society, private sector as quickly as possible to build up that relationship of trust.
And it dovetails with a question that's come in from Ricardo Pinho, who asks what instruments are being put in place to ensure the necessary financial resources are in place for the implementation of the New Urban Agenda? Is it a matter of public investment, and or what's the role of private investors? Jeannie, can I shift to you for that one? We'll need to unmute you.
Sorry, I had to unmute that. Could you say that again? Excuse me.
Sure. What instruments are being put in place to ensure the necessary financial resources are in place for implementation of the New Urban Agenda? And it's a question also of how much of that is public and how much of that should we expect from private investors?
Okay, there are a lot of things in the works. One thing I'd like to point out is the World Bank activity, which has established a training group of sessions to enable local municipalities to know and equip themselves to become credit worthy. If we want the private sector to be involved in helping finance activities, the responsibility of the local government is also to become credit worthy, to be able to attract the private sector into these kinds of activities, because the sector obviously has a bottom line. It's not just becoming credit worthy, but becoming sophisticated about what kind of instruments are available and how to choose those instruments to advance everybody's interests in the fairest way. Other member states are thinking about where they need to make critical and strategic investments to enhance sustainable urbanization, and that through their foreign aid programs, they are obviously having these conversations around questions of infrastructure, questions of capacity building, and so forth. So you have things happening both at the global level as member states, the developing world are thinking about what kind of contributions they can make and how they can make them most effectively. You have contributions at the local level thinking about what are the resources that the localities can generate themselves to support the kinds of activities that they need to have in their communities, whether they're having a program based on cadastre assessments, whether they're how to support the kind of economic development that will create the prosperity that is needed through agglomeration economies and so forth. There's no single answer to this. It is very, very tailored to the situation, but there's a lot of thought going into it from the various sectors that exist around the world.
Christine, here's a question that seems tailor-made for you. What role do you see for architects and planners for the implementation and promotion of the New Urban Agenda?
Well, I won't give the obvious and facetious one, but clearly very, very important and central. Well, I think when you have a look at the contents of the New Urban Agenda, and when you think about the discussion we had in the Professionals Roundtable in Quito, it's very clear that the focus is going to remain on the built environment or human settlements professions, and that's architects, planners, engineers, the people who need to deliver the integrated planning, the infrastructure planning, and all of those traditional kind of professional areas of expertise. But the point that was made in the Professionals Roundtable in Quito is that the New Urban Agenda, quite correctly, is starting to look at the urbanization process as a strategic, integrated, cross-governance kind of issue, which it is, and it requires those kinds of solutions. And it therefore requires areas of expertise, which I think I've mentioned already, are not traditionally thought of as being part of the traditional human settlements and built environment professions. And it's things like the things that Jeannie's just been talking about, the innovative financial mechanisms, the creative new ways of approaching local government financing. And it's things like the question from one of the earlier participants around health. And if you go back a decade or two, I don't think we were speaking much around health and the built environment, and it's now critical. There's a new realization of the importance of that, as Nicholas has already alluded to. So the professional input is going to now be broader because there's now this recognition that the issue of urbanization is very complex and very broad. And then in terms of the resources to deliver it, some of us will be producing papers and thinking about things, so we'll be bringing to the table the blood, sweat and tears, if you will, perhaps through the professions or through civil society. Government will be doing some strategic interventions, which Eugenie has spoken about. Also creating the enabling environment, which we haven't really touched upon, but the New Urban Agenda talks about enabling frameworks, enabling legal and policy frameworks. And then, of course, it's also about the new thinking. And when you think about informality, it's not just slums and where people live, but it's also the informal economy and how that needs to be supported or maybe managed in different ways. So very complex challenges facing us in the 21st century requires massive partnerships, new ways of thinking, and all sorts of people involved who perhaps traditionally have not been involved in the more narrow interpretation of urban development that we have had up until now.
Nicholas, next question I'm going to ask you just because I heard you address this last week and you had a pretty good answer for it. So this one comes from Carol Archer. And the question is there a process at UN Habitat to allow for monitoring and evaluation how countries are responding to the New Urban Agenda?
Well, it's not just going to be UN Habitat. I think we have a pretty good base for monitoring progress, especially at the national level, in the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. And these are the several hundred indicators that the UN Office for Statistics has been, Commission for Statistics has been able to come up with in consultation with member states. So we have a quantitative means of measuring how we progress, and you know, some people are saying that we might have to add a few more quantitative indicators to monitor the implementation of the New Urban Agenda. But I strongly believe that what UN Habitat and other partners can bring to the table that will be critical, given everything we've said until now, the role of importance of local authorities, of civil society, of partnerships, is to have a qualitative monitoring of the implementation of the New Urban Agenda. Who is doing what, where, and how, so that we can really learn the lessons from what people are doing on the ground, how they're being able to resolve problems, how they are able to meet the challenges of rapid urbanization, globalization, climate change, and how those lessons can be shared almost in real time to the benefit of all other people that are trying to do very similar things. So I think there is a very important space there, a very important role for UN Habitat to play as a leader, convening other partners to do the qualitative monitoring of the implementation of the New Urban Agenda.
You're just about out of time, but since we're talking about sort of roles of organizations, Jeannie, I did want to ask you the GAP. This was a very innovative structure for gathering feedback from different stakeholders as part of the Habitat process. It is going to continue. What's it going to be doing next?
Thanks for that question, Chris. Begun a process for creating GAP 2.0 that is thinking about the role that GAP might play in implementation. Just yesterday, we issued a questionnaire to all our membership to respond to the new roles that this might be. We'll be engaged in a process to put this all together, and we'll be putting it to a vote of the membership, and hopefully have all this done by April, where we would hope to convene the 6th plenary session of GAP. So stay tuned. We'll keep you all informed about the process, and we hopefully will have a very strong group that will be able to help in the implementation activities.
Great, thank you. Well, we're at time, and I think we have many more questions that we could possibly answer, and I think that's maybe a sign that we should be doing more of these webinars in 2017, because clearly there's a lot of interest and a lot of questions and a lot of energy around these issues. So I want to thank all of our guests for joining us today. Thank you for all of the attendees for coming, for asking lots of really good questions. I will follow up with all of you with an email that will have some of the materials that we talked about attached to it, as well as where you can find a video of this recording if you want to share it with colleagues who were not able to join us today. So thank you very much for joining us, and have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.